The eggs were already in the pan when the sun touched the ridgeline. Wickvoss stood at the stove in the same way he had stood at that stove for 40 years, weight on his left heel, right hand working the spatula in slow circles, watching the edges of the eggs go from clear to white, the way a man watches something he has done so many times that the watching itself has become a kind of prayer. The kitchen was quiet. It was always quiet now. That was the thing about a house after someone leaves it. Not the dramatic quiet of absence, not the loud silence of grief, but something more ordinary and therefore harder. The quiet of a room that has simply stopped expecting a second person to walk into it. He slid the eggs onto the plate and sat down at the table. The blue cup was already there. He had filled it before he cracked the eggs, the way he always did, the way June had always done before him, so that the coffee was the first thing on the table and everything else arranged itself around it. The cup was enamelware, the kind they sold at church sales and county fairs in the 1950s, blue with a white rim worn down to bare metal on the drinking edge from 30 years of morning use. June had bought it at the First Baptist Fall Social in 1959 for 15 cents, back when she was still a young woman, and the mountains had looked exactly as they looked this morning, and would look long after both of them were gone. He drank the coffee and did not think about June directly. That was something he had learned in the months since January. You did not think about her directly the way you did not look directly at the sun. You let her exist at the edges of things. The particular way the morning light came through the east window and fell across the table at an angle she would have called pretty. The sound the screen door made when the wind moved it, the sound she had always said needed fixing, and that he had never fixed and now would not fix for reasons he could not have explained to anyone. The notebook was open on the table beside his plate. He had been reading it since 4:30 that morning, sitting in the same chair working through it for perhaps the 30th time in 6 weeks, not because he needed to learn anything new from it, but because reading it had become its own ritual, its own form of preparation. The notebook was a composition book, the kind you bought at the five and dime, the kind that had been sold at every hardware store and general store in eastern Kentucky since before he was born. Black and white cover, ruled pages. The handwriting inside was small and meticulous, the writing of a man who had understood that space on a page was limited and that every word therefore needed to earn its place. Clem Ferris had written it over the course of 40 years. Wick turned to the page he had been studying for the past 2 weeks, a page in the middle of the notebook where Clem had recorded his settings for drought year corn harvest on rocky slope ground. The entry was dated August 1962, and it began with 3 words that Wick had come to think of as the key to everything run slow first. What followed was 6 lines of specific instruction: cylinder speed, concave clearance, reel, timing, ground speed in relation to stock density, and moisture content. At the bottom of the entry, Clem had written a single additional note in smaller letters as if it were an afterthought, though Wick suspected it was anything but the ground tells you what it needs if you listen longer than one season. He closed the notebook, he pushed back from the table and carried his plate to the sink and washed it the way he washed everything thoroughly and without hurry. Then he put on his hat and went out to the barn. The morning was already warm. Letcher County in August was warm before 6 and hot before 8, and by 10 it was the kind of heat that a man from somewhere else would call brutal and a man from here would call August. The mountains held the heat the way they held everything close and complete, the ridges on both sides of the hollow rising steep and covered in second growth timber that had been coming back since the last round of serious cutting in the 1940s. The air smelled of dry grass and machine oil and the particular sweetness of late summer corn that has been pushing through a drought and is doing the best it can with what it has been given. Wick walked to the barn and went inside and stood for a moment in the particular darkness of a barn in early morning, the light coming in only through the gaps in the siding and the open door behind him, falling in long, thin lines across the floor and across the machine that sat in the center of the main bay. Fully assembled now, every belt and bearing and separator drum in the condition that 6 weeks of night work had been able to achieve. The Alice Chalmers Model 60 all-crop harvester had been built in West Allis, Wisconsin in the spring of 1952. Serial number F61204. It had come off the line painted in the particular shade of orange that Alice Chalmers used, a color they called Persian orange that was deeper and warmer than the safety orange that machinery manufacturers would adopt in later decades. This was a color that meant something. It was the color of a tool made by people who understood that the thing they were making would be the most important piece of equipment on the farm that owned it, and that it deserved to look like something a man would be proud to drive out of the barn on a harvest morning. Wick crouched at the front of the machine and checked the main drive belt by feel, pressing his thumb against it to test the tension the way Clem's notebook specified, firm, but with a 1/4 inch of give. He had replaced this belt 3 weeks ago, a B-section V-belt, 68 inches long, that he had found at the Tractor Supply in Whitesburg for $11.40. He had driven to Whitesburg specifically for it, 22 miles on roads that followed the creek beds the way roads in this part of Kentucky always did, bending with the water because the mountains gave no other option. The belt was right. He moved to the cylinder housing and checked the clearance on the concave, the gap between the rotating cylinder and the fixed concave plate below it through which the grain passed during separation. The clearance was set to Clem's drought year specification, slightly wider than standard to reduce the cracking of grain that had already lost moisture to a summer that had not produced meaningful rain in 41 days. This was the adjustment that mattered most on ground like Harmon Buell's East Field. Wick had made it the previous evening and had checked it twice since then. He stood up and looked at the machine for a moment. Then he went back to the house, picked up the blue cup, finished the last of the coffee that had gone almost cold, and set the cup down on the counter where it would be waiting when he came back. He had been 63 years old for 4 months. He had been farming the 67 acres on Route 119 for 38 years, first with his father, then with June from the day they married in 1965, and then the two of them together, until his father passed in 1971 and left them with the full weight of it, and then with June alone until January of this year, when she had gone out on an iced road on a Tuesday morning and not come back. He grew corn and tobacco and kept a few head of cattle, the mixed operation that this part of Kentucky seemed to require, the kind of farming that did not make you rich and did not let you quit, and asked everything you had every single season without offering any guarantee about the next one. The farm was $4,200 behind on its operating loan at the Letcher County branch of the Cumberland Valley Bank. That number had been sitting in his chest since March, like a stone he could not put down. Not a crippling weight he had carried heavier, but a constant one present in the particular way that debts are present, announcing themselves at unexpected moments in the middle of a field row, in the first seconds of waking in the silence between one task and the next, when there was nothing else to occupy the space. The farm was also, he knew, the only thing standing between him and a kind of emptiness he did not want to consider too directly. He had no children. He had his neighbors, some of whom were friends in the way that men in rural places are friends through proximity and shared circumstance, and the long record of doing difficult things in each other's company. He had the land itself, which had its own claim on him that was different from and older than the bank's claim, the claim of ground that a man has walked and worked and learned to read over the course of decades until his own knowledge of it and the land itself have become difficult to separate. He had the notebook. He had found it 8 weeks ago on the first Saturday in July in a storage unit he had not been intending to bid on at an auction. He had not been intending to stop at. The Nave storage facility on the edge of Neon had been built in 1961 by a man named Delbert Nave. 12 corrugated metal units arranged in a single row behind a wire fence. the kind of facility that existed in every small town in eastern Kentucky, providing the particular service of allowing people to store the things they could not bear to throw away but could no longer keep at home. Delbert Nave had died in April at the age of 81 with no living relatives in the state, and his estate had gone to the county, and the county had arranged the auction with the efficiency and mild indifference of a bureaucratic body dealing with a minor matter on a busy schedule. Wick had been driving to the feed store. He had seen the auction sign and slowed the way you slow for things that pull at something unspecified in you. And he had seen the unit numbers on the doors, and he had stopped the truck and gotten out. Because Unit 7 bore a number he recognized from a padlock he had seen on that particular door for 15 years before the lock had stopped meaning anything and the door had simply stayed closed. Clem Ferris had rented Unit 7. Clem had farmed the hollow above Route 119 from 1939 until his death in 1979, 67 acres of mixed ground, not unlike Wick's own. And he had been the kind of neighbor who existed in this part of Kentucky with a frequency that people from other places found surprising. The kind who showed up when a thing needed doing and disappeared when the doing was done and never once mentioned it afterward, as if help were simply a condition of the landscape rather than a transaction between individuals. Clem had died without direct heirs. His farm had gone to a nephew in Hazard who had sold it within the year. His storage unit had apparently been forgotten in the settlement or simply not worth the trouble of addressing, and so it had sat for 8 years with its lock on and its contents undisturbed. Wick had bid $30. He had been the only bidder. He had driven to the facility with his truck and a trailer and a bolt cutter, and he had cut the lock and pulled back the door and stood in the entrance for a long moment while his eyes adjusted to the interior dimness and began to make sense of what was inside. The machine was under a canvas tarp, the color of old moss, a tarp that had been heavy once and had dried to a stiff, fragile shell over 8 years of temperature cycles inside the metal unit. He had pulled it back from the front and revealed the header of the machine, and he had stood there looking at what the light showed him and had felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately identify. The Alice Chalmers Model 60 was not a rare machine in the general sense. Alice Chalmers had produced them from 1940 through 1958 and had sold them across the agricultural Midwest and Upper South in numbers that meant most farming counties in this part of the country had seen at least a few. But this one had been stored with a care that spoke of someone who understood what they were putting away. The canvas had protected the paint on the main body. The moving parts had been coated with something petroleum grease applied heavily and deliberately in a way that suggested whoever had prepared the machine for storage had intended it to come back out again. Clem had intended it to come back out. Wick had understood this when he found the manual. It was in the grain tank of the machine, wrapped in a square of oil-stained canvas, tied with a piece of baling twine that had gone brittle but held. Inside the canvas was the original Alice Chalmers Operator's Manual for the Model 60 printed in 1952 and annotated throughout in Clem's small, precise handwriting. Beside the manual, folded inside it, were 3 sheets of Clem's personal adjustment charts, tables he had developed over years of use, that translated the manual's general specifications into settings specific to the ground conditions of Letcher County. And beneath the adjustment charts in its own wrapper was the notebook. He had read it in the truck parked outside the storage facility with the trailer still hitched behind him, the July heat building in the cab and the windows down, and nothing in his immediate awareness except the pages turning under his hands and the handwriting of a man who had been dead for 8 years, filling in something that Wick had not known was empty. Clem had started the notebook in the early 1950s, shortly after he acquired the Model 60. He had organized it by crop type and condition, each section beginning with a general description of the harvest situation, and then proceeding to specific machine settings, adjustments made in response to specific conditions, observations about what had worked, and what had not, and why. The sections on corn were the most extensive. The sections on drought year corn on slope ground were the most detailed of all. Clem had harvested Harmon Buell's East Field, not once, not twice, but across the span of years in the 1960s and early 1970s when Harmon had hired him to work the difficult acreage that his own equipment struggled with. There were 4 separate entries about the Buell East Field, each one building on the previous, each one adding detail that the earlier entries had not captured. The final entry dated August 1974, 5 years before Clem's death, was 6 pages long and included a hand-drawn diagram of the field's topography, marking the shale ledge at the northeast corner and the false flat 2/3 of the way down the slope that changed grade without announcing itself, the place where every new operator lost time and sometimes equipment. Wick had read those 6 pages 4 times before he started the truck. He had spent the following 4 weeks in his barn at night. The work had begun with assessment. He had gone through the machine systematically, checking every component against the manual's maintenance specifications, noting what was functional, what was marginal, what had failed. The separator drum had seized, frozen by rust at both bearing points, and freeing it had required 3 evenings of patient work with penetrating oil and a bearing puller borrowed from his neighbor Dale Combs down the road. The original canvas elevator belt had rotted through at 2 points and needed replacement, a section he had sourced through a salvage dealer in Paintsville after writing a letter and waiting 10 days for the response. 3 of the 4 real bat boards were cracked or missing entirely, and he had fabricated replacements from oak he had in the barn, cutting and shaping them by hand to match the original dimensions specified in the manual. The new main drive belt had cost $11.40 at the Tractor Supply in Whitesburg. The canvas belt section from the salvage dealer had cost $9. A set of separator grate liners, which he had found through the Agricultural Museum in Lexington, after a phone call that had required explaining what he was looking for to 3 different people before he reached someone who understood, had cost $6.50. The hardware and shop supplies, the penetrating oil and the bearing grease and the replacement fasteners and the paint thinner he had used to clean the Persian orange back to something close to its original depth on the sections he could reach, had amounted to another $2.90. Total parts cost for the restoration of a 35-year-old harvester, $29.40. He had spent the $2.60 that remained from his $30 investment on a cup of coffee and a piece of chess pie at the Dairy Cheer on Route 119 on the Wednesday night, 3 weeks into the work, when the separator was finally turning freely and the elevator belt was installed and the machine had begun to look under the barn light like something that might actually run. He had sat at the Dairy Cheer counter alone with the notebook and the pie and had gone through Clem's drought year corn section one more time, making notes on a separate piece of paper, cross-referencing Clem's observations with his own 30 years of watching the specific behavior of the Cedar Creek bottomland and the Buell slope ground and the particular way that the morning fog came off the water on the east side of the county. He was not building a case. He was not planning anything. He was simply in the way of a man who has spent his life learning the ground beneath his feet, trying to understand the complete picture. Tuck Dillard had given him a reason to use what he understood. Tuck was 38 years old and had inherited from his father, Rex Dillard, who had died of a heart attack at 62, in the comfortable circumstances of a man whose financial decisions had consistently worked in his direction, 312 acres of the best bottomland in Letcher County, and a John Deere dealership on the main road through Whitesburg that did, it had to be said, quite well. Rex Dillard had been a capable man in his way. He had understood land values and had purchased during the lean years of the early 1970s, when farmers who needed cash were willing to sell at prices that reflected their need rather than their land's worth. He had understood dealerships and had acquired the John Deere franchise at a moment when the shift from small mixed farming to larger commodity production was accelerating in this part of Kentucky, which meant that the market for the large modern equipment he sold was growing precisely as he was positioned to serve it. What Rex had not fully transmitted to his son, perhaps because it was not fully transmissible, was any of the knowledge that came from actually working ground. Tuck had operated equipment from an early age. He had a feel for machines in the way that some people have a feel for machinery, regardless of whether they have studied it, an instinctive competence in the seat of a thing that let him run it well under ordinary conditions. What he did not have was the other knowledge, the knowledge of what the ground under the machine was doing and why. The knowledge of what the crop was telling you if you were paying attention to it rather than to the machine's gauges. The knowledge that comes from standing in a field at 5 in the morning, 40 years in a row, and watching what the light and the moisture and the temperature do to the same piece of ground in different years and different conditions until you have a model of that ground in your head that is more accurate than any instrument can produce. Tuck Dillard had never needed that knowledge. He had always had access to the most current equipment, which was designed to compensate for the absence of that knowledge through the application of horsepower and technology. When the ground was difficult, you drove a bigger machine. When the crop was variable, you adjusted the settings on a computer display. When you lost grain on a rocky slope, you accepted the loss as a condition of the terrain rather than as a failure of understanding. This was not stupidity. It was the logical adaptation of a man operating in conditions that had never required him to know anything beyond what the equipment could manage on its own. The Letcher County Equipment Auction ran every second Saturday in August in the parking lot and adjacent fields behind the Whitesburg Fairgrounds, drawing farmers and dealers from 3 counties for the combination of commerce and social occasion that such events provided in places where community was still a real and functional thing rather than a concept. Equipment changed hands. Stories were told. The social accounting of a farming county who had a good year and who had a hard one, who was expanding and who was quietly contracting, was conducted and updated in the conversations that moved through the crowd between the rows of machinery. Wick had driven his 1974 Ford F100 to the auction with the machine on the trailer behind it. He had not advertised this. He had not told anyone he was coming. He had simply loaded the machine early in the morning after the final check of the belt tension and the concave clearance and the separator drum, and driven the 23 miles to Whitesburg on roads that ran along the creek beds, as they always had, and backed the trailer into the shade at the far end of the fairgrounds lot, where the sycamores along the fence created a strip of cool shadow in the already warm morning. Tuck Dillard had been there since 7, his 1987 John Deere 662 combine positioned in the center of the main display area where the morning light caught the new paint and the clean glass of the air-conditioned cab and the articulated header in a way that communicated without requiring any words. Exactly the kind of statement Tuck intended it to communicate. The 6620 was a legitimate machine, 405 horsepower, 20-foot header, less than 200 hours on the engine. Its list price at the Dillard dealership was $47,200, a number that Tuck had mentioned in conversation at least 4 times before 9 in the morning. He was not lying about it. He was not even particularly boasting. He was simply operating from the assumption, which his experience had consistently confirmed, that the most expensive and most powerful option was the best option, and that demonstrating this fact required primarily that the option be visible. He saw Wick arrive. He watched the F100 back the trailer into the shade, and he let a moment pass before he walked toward it, gathering the small audience that tends to accumulate around a man who moves with the confident expectation of being followed. He pulled back the edge of the canvas without asking. That was the detail that Wick would remember longest afterward, Not the words that came after it, not the laughter, not the particular quality of the crowd's response. Just the hand reaching out and taking hold of the canvas without asking whether it was all right to do so. The gesture of a man who had never developed the habit of asking because asking had never been necessary. The Persian orange paint showed through the grime on the header in the morning light. Tuck stepped back. He turned to the men who had gathered, and he said something about a 1952 machine at a drought harvest. He said something about jokes and prayers, and whether what he was looking at was the funniest thing they had seen this year or the saddest. He said it with a grin that invited the room to agree with him, and some of the room agreed the way rooms agree with the loudest and most confident voice when the situation is ambiguous and agreement requires nothing. Ronnie Fitch, who farmed 80 acres on the Poor Fork Road and had driven to the auction to look at a used cultivator, was standing near the back of the small crowd. He was 29 years old and had been farming his family's ground for 6 years and was still in the phase of farming where you are primarily learning how much you do not yet know. He looked at the machine on the trailer and then at Wick Voss standing beside it with his hat in his hands, and he felt something that he could not have named precisely, but that kept him from laughing. He said, "Will it run?" Wick said, "It will run." Tuck Dillard had an audience and a proposition in the same moment, which was the combination he found most useful. He told Wick he had a bet, his 6,620 against whatever Wick cared to put up. Side by side on Harmon Buell's East Field, 37 acres of slope ground with shale ledge and drought-dry soil, and a grade that had ended more than one harvest attempt. Whoever harvested more usable grain by sunset won. He said it the way a man says a thing he expects to be accepted, in the tone of someone describing an outcome rather than proposing a competition. The crowd went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Because there was something about Harmon Buell's East Field that everyone standing in that lot knew. It was the worst harvesting ground in the county, or close to it. The big machines, the modern combines with their wide headers and their air-conditioned cabs and their 400 horsepower, had a history on that field. They lost headers to the shale. They lost time to the false grade change. They produced cracked grain and mechanical trouble, and operators who came off the field in the late afternoon with the expression of men who had been reminded that some things do not yield to horsepower. Tuck Dillard had never harvested that field. Wick Voss looked at it from where he was standing, visible in the middle distance, past the fairgrounds fence, the slope running up away from the creek toward the ridge, the corn on it drought thin and dry and patient, waiting for whatever came next. He looked at the machine on the trailer. He looked at Tuck. He said, "All right." There were no more words between them after that. The crowd parted the way crowds part when a thing has been decided and all that remains is the doing of it. Tuck walked back toward his combine with the easy stride of a man who has achieved what he came to achieve. Ronnie Fitch stood where he was for a moment and then went to find his truck, not to leave, but to drive out to Harmon Buell's place, because something about the way Wick Voss had said, "All right," made him feel like he should be there when the day was done. Wick pulled the canvas back over the machine. He walked to the cab of the Ford and got in and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel and the engine off. He was thinking about the notebook. Not about what was in it. He knew what was in it. He was thinking about Clem Ferris sitting at whatever table Clem had sat at in whatever light Clem had used in the evenings after harvest seasons, that had probably felt very much like this one, writing down what he had learned that day, what the machine had told him and what the ground had told him, and what the combination of the two, run with patience and with attention, had been able to produce from ground that everyone else had decided was more trouble than it was worth. He was thinking about the fact that Clem had done this for 40 years, and that the thing he had built from those 40 years, the accumulated specific knowledge of one machine on one county's ground across 4 decades, had sat in a storage unit for 8 years because there had been no one to receive it. Until Wick had stopped his truck on a July morning for a reason he could not have explained. He started the engine and pulled forward toward the gate. The fairgrounds were filling behind him, the ordinary business of the auction, resuming the voices of men and the sounds of machinery and the particular noise of a county that was having a hard summer and was going about its work anyway. The way counties in this part of Kentucky had always gone about their work, without complaint and without particular expectation of relief. Wick Voss drove toward Harmon Buell's east field. He had Clem's notebook in the cab beside him closed, now resting on the bench seat with the small authority of a thing that contains more than its exterior suggests. He had 20 years of watching that field in his memory. He had a machine that had been built to do exactly this work, restored to the condition it needed to be in, to do it at a total cost of $59.40, including the purchase price. He had a long day ahead of him, and the morning was already warm, and the corn on the slope was dry and waiting, and somewhere in the distance, Harmon Buell was sitting on the tailgate of his truck, watching the road for the first trucks to arrive with the particular expression of a man who has owned difficult ground for 40 years and has learned to be interested rather than anxious about whatever the ground chooses to do next. Wick Voss drove. The mountains on both sides of the road were the same mountains. They had always been old and complete and entirely unimpressed by what was happening below them. The cup was on the counter at home. He would be back for it before dark. Harmon Buell's east field looked the way all difficult ground looks in a drought summer, which is to say it looked like a problem that had been there longer than anyone currently living, and that would be there after everyone currently living had finished arguing about it. The field ran from the county road at the bottom to a tree line at the top, 37 acres of slope, ground that climbed at an angle steep enough to make a man conscious of his knees on the way up and his balance on the way down. The corn on it was drought corn, which meant it was shorter than it should have been, and drier than it should have been, and more valuable per standing stock than it would have been in a wet year, because in a drought year, every kernel that made it to harvest was a kernel that had fought for its existence and deserved to be counted. The soil was the particular gray-brown of Letcher County slope, ground thin over shale, in the upper sections deeper and darker near the creek at the eastern edge where the morning fog came off the water and deposited its moisture in a pattern that you could read in the crop if you knew what you were looking at. Wick knew what he was looking at. He had pulled the trailer to the upper gate and unhitched it and driven the Ford down the road to park it at the fence line where the other trucks were already beginning to accumulate. The machine sat on the trailer at the upper gate orange and patient in the morning light, waiting for him to come back and drive it off. He counted 19 vehicles along the fence line when he walked back up the road. By the time he had driven the Alice Chalmers off the trailer on its own belt drive and positioned it at the north edge of the field, there were 31. The word had moved through Whitesburg and out along the creek roads, the way words move in places where everyone knows everyone, not through any single channel, but through all channels, simultaneously, the phone calls and the CB radios, and the men who had been at the fairgrounds and had driven home and told their wives, and the wives had told their neighbors, and the neighbors had called their brothers, and the brothers had driven out to see for themselves. By 9 in the morning, there were 47 people at the fence line along the bottom road, standing in the particular posture of a crowd that has come to watch something it is not entirely sure how to categorize. Harmon Buell was on his tailgate. He was 71 years old and had owned this field since 1951 and had farmed it with varying equipment and varying success for 36 years. And he had a relationship with its difficulties that had long since moved past frustration into something more like companionship. He knew where the shale ledge ran. He knew the false flat. He knew the creekside moisture pattern. He knew all of this the way you know the habits of something you have lived alongside for decades, not as information, but as intuition, the knowledge that bypasses language and lives directly in the body. He watched Wick Voss position the machine at the north fence row, and he watched Tuck Dillard drive his 6620 to the east edge of the field on its own road capability, and he folded his arms across his chest and settled in for what the day was going to produce. He was not worried. He had been watching Wick Voss work ground since 1961. Tuck Dillard started the 6620 from the cab at 9:15. The John Deere diesel came up with a sound that warranted the word thunder, a controlled and purposeful thunder, the sound of 175 horsepower deciding to work. The cab was air-conditioned. The glass was tinted. Inside it, Tuck sat in an ergonomic seat with the controls arranged around him with the logic of a cockpit, everything positioned where a hand or a foot could reach it without the operator needing to look away from the field. The display screen showed him what the sensors were reading. The header was 20 feet wide. The separator engagement was electric. He drove the header down to working height and engaged the feeder house and moved into the standing corn at the east side of the field with the authority of a man and a machine that had been designed for exactly this purpose. It went well for 60 yards. The corn went in steady, and the rotor processed it, and the clean grain moved to the tank, and the residue went out the back, and the machine did what it had been built to do, which was to move a large amount of crop through a large amount of processing with the efficiency that $47,000 of engineering could produce. From the fence line, watching it work, you could understand why a man would believe that this was simply the correct answer to the question of how to harvest a field. It was large, and it was loud, and it was doing the thing it was supposed to do. Then it hit the shale ledge. The ledge ran 3 inches below the surface at the northeast corner of the field, a fact that Clem Ferris had recorded in his final entry about the Buell East Field, and that Wick had known from 20 years of watching Harmon work it with equipment that had learned the hard way where the rock was. The header of the 6620 dropped slightly into a low spot, and the leading edge caught the top of the shale, and the machine bucked once hard, the front end lifting and dropping with a violence that was disproportionate to the size of the obstruction, the way impacts always feel more severe when they are unexpected. Tuck compensated, immediately raising the header on the electric control, but the moment of contact had been enough. A gathering chain on the left side of the header had slipped its drive sprocket and would need to be manually reseated before the machine could continue without risking further damage. He shut down and climbed out. The fence line was quiet. The particular quiet of a crowd watching a man work on a machine that has just demonstrated a limitation is different from other kinds of quiet. It is not hostile and it is not sympathetic. It is the quiet of people who are accumulating information, updating their assessment of the situation, waiting to see what comes next before they decide what to think. Tuck reset the chain with the efficiency of someone who knew his own equipment and had dealt with this particular failure mode before. It took 4 minutes and 11 seconds, timed by Walt Greer, who had arrived at the field in his extension service truck at 9 sharp, and set up his notebook and his moisture meter on the tailgate of a truck near the lower gate, and had been making entries in his methodical way since the first machine entered the field. Walt was 44 years old and had been with the Letcher County Extension Service for 17 years. He had the professional neutrality of someone who had spent 2 decades measuring things and had learned that measurements meant more than opinions. He was not rooting for either machine. He was recording what happened, and what happened was what it was independent of what anyone in the field or at the fence line wanted it to be. Wick had entered the field from the north fence row while Tuck was dealing with the header chain. He came in at what looked from the fence line like an absurd pace. The Alice Chalmers moved at 2 miles per hour, pulled by the Ford in low gear, the drawbar hitch, connecting the two in the simple mechanical relationship that pull-type harvesters had used since before any person currently watching had been born. At 2 miles per hour, a man walking briskly could keep pace with the machine. At 2 miles per hour, 37 acres of slope ground represented a very long day of very slow work. But Clem's notebook had been specific. Drought corn on rocky slope ground. Clem had written in the 1962 entry that Wick had read 30 times. Run slow first. Cylinder at 975 revolutions per minute. Full concave clearance. Do not push the ground speed until you know what the afternoon moisture is doing. The note at the bottom of that entry in the smaller handwriting that Clem used for things he considered most important speed without knowledge costs more than it saves. Wick ran the machine the way Clem had said to run it. The sound it made was different from the sound the 620 made, where the John Deere was loud with the confidence of size, the Alice Chalmers was quiet with the confidence of purpose. The cylinder turned at its specified speed. The concave cleared the grain at its specified gap. The elevator lifted the separated grain to the tank in the steady, rhythmic way of a mechanism that has been set correctly and is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The reel turned. The auger moved. The whole machine worked at its 2 miles per hour with a sound that carried in the August morning air with a particular quality, a steady mechanical conversation conducted at a volume that allowed the sounds of the field to exist alongside it. The corn going in, the birds in the tree line, the distant sound of traffic on the road below. From the fence line, it looked almost restful. Ronnie Fitch had parked his truck at the gate and was standing on the bottom rail of the fence with his arms over the top wire, watching both machines work. He was a young man in the way that young farmers are young, not with innocence, but with the specific variety of unfinished knowledge that comes from having worked hard at something for long enough to know how much you do not yet understand. He watched Wick's machine move at its 2 miles per hour through the drought corn, and he watched Tuck's machine resume after the chain repair and move at its considerably faster pace through the same crop. And he tried to calculate in his head what the end of the day would look like. He could not. The math was too dependent on variables he did not know how to measure. By 10:30, the temperature at the fence line was 91 degrees. The heat came straight down from a sky that had been doing this for 41 days and had developed a certain commitment to it. The smell of dry corn dust had settled over the field, that particular combination of dry starch and desiccated silk, and the faint sweetness of grain that has been converting its sugars in the long stress of a drought summer. The dust from both machines rose and drifted on what little air was moving and deposited itself on everything it touched, on the shirts of the men at the fence, on the windshields of the trucks, on Harmon Buell's forearms, where they rested on his folded hands on the tailgate. Harmon had not moved from his tailgate in 90 minutes. He had watched Tuck work the east side of the field, and he had watched Wick work the north section, and he had been doing the kind of ongoing assessment that a man does when he knows a piece of ground intimately and is watching two different approaches to it at the same time. He was not a man who said much, and this morning he said nothing. He looked at the field, and he looked at the machines, and he looked at the people at the fence, and his expression maintained itself in the condition of someone who is not surprised by what he is seeing. Walt Greer called the noon break at 12 sharp. Both machines came to the lower end of the field. Wick shut down the Ford, and the Alice Chalmers went quiet together, the cylinder spinning down through its harmonics from working speed to stillness in the particular descending sequence that Wick had been listening to for 6 weeks of testing and adjustment. Tuck shut down the 620 from the cab and climbed down, and the crowd at the fence shifted, and some of them came through the gate and some of them stayed where they were. And there was a general movement toward the shade of the sycamores and toward the water jugs that several trucks had in their beds. Walt Greer took his grain samples. He had been pulling them every 45 minutes from the tanks of both machines using a grain probe to extract samples from different depths and positions in each tank, bagging them separately, labeling them with the time and the machine and the approximate field position. At the noon break, he set up his assessment station on the tailgate, his moisture meter and his crack assessment screen and his scale, and he worked through the accumulated samples with the systematic attention of a man who understood that what he was measuring would matter to people and therefore needed to be measured correctly. Tuck's morning numbers came back first. 14.3 acres harvested. Grain moisture at 15.2%, which was appropriate for the conditions. But the crack rate was 18%, nearly 1 grain in 5, showing visible damage from the cylinder action running at the speed and clearance settings that the machine's onboard system had recommended for general corn harvest conditions. At 18% crack rate, the standard dockage schedules at the elevator would reduce the effective value of the grain significantly. Running the adjusted numbers against the morning's volume produced an effective yield of 67 bushels per effective acre, accounting for the quality reduction. Wick's numbers took longer because there were fewer of them. 9.1 acres harvested, slower pace, less ground covered. The crack rate was 4%, not 4 times lower than Tuck's rate, more than 4 times lower. 4% on drought-stressed corn that had every reason to shatter under mechanical action was a number that reflected the correct cylinder speed, the correct concave clearance, and the correct ground speed for the crop condition. The effective yield calculation came back at 71 bushels per effective acre. Walt Greer wrote the numbers in his notebook. He drew a line under each one. He did not say anything immediately. He was a man who understood that numbers sometimes needed a moment before they were spoken aloud, that there was a difference between recording a result and announcing it, and that the announcing deserved to happen in the right way. Ronnie Fitch was standing close enough to see Walt's notebook, and he saw the numbers before anyone said them out loud. He looked at the numbers for a moment, and then he looked out at the field, and then he looked at Wick Voss, who was sitting on the drawbar of the Alice Chalmers in the shade of the machine itself, eating a sandwich he had brought from home and drinking water from a mason jar, not looking at Walt's notebook, not looking at Tuck's machine, not performing any of the visible anxiety that the situation might have seemed to warrant. He was simply eating his lunch in the shade on a hot day. Harmon Buell had come off his tailgate and walked to Walt's station when the samples went in. He looked at the notebook page when Walt was done writing. He nodded once, not with surprise, with recognition. The nod of a man whose understanding of a piece of ground has just been confirmed by data that matches what the ground itself had been telling him for 30 years, if anyone had been listening to it correctly. Tuck Dillard read the numbers at Walt's station and was quiet for a moment in the way that a man is quiet when the data in front of him does not match the model he has been operating from. He did not argue. That was something. There were men who would have argued, who would have found procedural objections or questioned the sample methodology or reframed the comparison in terms that favored their numbers. Tuck did not do any of these things. He looked at the numbers for a moment longer, and then he went to his machine and climbed in and started the engine and drove to the water point to refill the cooling system. The afternoon break lasted 40 minutes. Wick used 10 of those minutes on the concave adjustment. He had been planning this adjustment since the morning, not because the morning's crack rate required it, but because Clem's notebook specified it. The entry from the 1974 field run at the Buell ground had included a notation about afternoon conditions, south slope, afternoon ground temp, elevated reduce cylinder, 50 RPM increase ground speed. The adjustment was not dramatic. 50 RPM on the cylinder and a half MPR increase in ground speed, moving from 2 miles per hour to 2.5 for the afternoon run. But it was specific calibrated to what this field did in the afternoon of an August harvest day, when the ground temperature rose and the remaining moisture in the stalks dropped and the crop responded differently to mechanical action than it had in the cooler morning. The adjustment required one tool, a 3/4 inch box wrench. It took 10 minutes because Wick had done it before in the barn at night, practicing the adjustment until his hands knew the motion and the correct resistance of the fastener at the right torque. He worked without hurry in the shade of the machine while the crowd at the fence ate their lunches and drank their water and talked in the way that people talk when they have watched something unexpected and are trying to find the language for it. Ronnie Fitch walked over while Wick was finishing the adjustment. He stood at a respectful distance, the way young men stand near older men who are working close enough to see but far enough not to intrude. And he watched the hands move on the concave bolt, and he watched the measurement check, and he did not say anything until the wrench was back on the drawbar hook, where Wick kept it. He asked how Wick knew what to adjust. Wick told him about the notebook. He said a man named Clem Ferris farmed this county from 1939 until 1979, and he wrote down everything he learned about this machine on this ground for 40 years. He is the one who knew what to adjust. I'm reading what he wrote. Ronnie looked at the notebook where it sat on the bench seat of the Ford, visible through the open window. He looked at the machine. He said, "Where did you get it?" Wick said, "Out of a storage unit for $30. Ronnie did not say anything else. He walked back to the fence and climbed up on the rail and stayed there for the rest of the afternoon. The second half of the day belonged to the field in the way that the second half of a difficult day always belongs to the field, which is to say that the field stopped being a setting and became the subject. The corn in the upper section was the best corn on the slope, the section where the ground was deepest, and the early summer rains had done the most good before the drought took hold, and both machines worked through it steadily. The 6620 at its faster pace, and the Alice Chalmers at its newly adjusted 2.5 miles per hour, the two of them working parallel lines on opposite sides of the field in the long, slow afternoon with the light coming down at the low angle of an August afternoon in the mountains and the dust rising from both machines into the still air. At 2 in the afternoon, Tuck Dillard entered the section of the field where the false flat was. 2/3 of the way down the slope, at the point where a man walking the field would feel the ground level off briefly before dropping again. There was a change in grade that Clem Ferris had recorded in 1964 and again in 1971 and had marked on his hand-drawn field diagram with a small notation, grade change here, unmarked surprises, first-time operators. The false flat was not dramatic. On foot, you could miss it if you were not paying attention. But on a machine, particularly a large machine with a wide header, riding at a precise working height above the surface, the change in grade translated into a sudden drop of the header relative to the intended cutting height, a drop that happened in the same instant that the ground fell away again on the far side of the leveling so that the header moved from flat to down before the operator's adjustment could compensate. Tuck was moving at his standard pace. His header was set at the height the computer recommended for the crop condition it had measured. When the grade changed, the header dropped. It happened in the same second that Tuck was processing a reading from the yield monitor on his display screen, which was providing him with data that required his attention. When he looked back up, the header was already into the ground, the leading edge in contact with the soil at an angle it was not designed for. And the machine made the sound that made every farmer at the fence line close their eyes. It was not a catastrophic sound. It was the sound of metal contacting ground at speed, a hard scraping impact that carries in it the implication of things bent or damaged or at minimum stressed beyond their intended tolerance. And the men along that fence line had enough collective experience with that sound to know exactly what it meant and exactly how much it was going to cost to find out. Tuck stopped the machine. He climbed down. He checked the header with the careful attention of a man who is simultaneously assessing mechanical damage and calculating time lost, both kinds of assessment happening in the same moment, neither one able to wait for the other. The header had made contact with the ground hard enough to bend the outer dividers on the left side and to rock the feeder house on its frame, but the damage was not structural. Nothing was broken that would prevent the machine from continuing. The dividers would need attention, but they would not stop the harvest. He straightened what he could straighten by hand. He climbed back in. He had lost 11 minutes. The fence line watched this in silence. not the silence of satisfaction, not the silence of men who are glad to see a man struggle, the silence of a community watching something that it recognizes the moment when the ground that everyone knew was difficult demonstrates its difficulty to someone who had not fully believed it until now. Harmon Buell watched from the tailgate. He had seen the same moment happen to different machines and different operators over 30 years on this field. Not always at the same spot, not always in the same way, but always carrying the same essential lesson, which was that the field's particular character was not optional, not something that could be overridden with enough horsepower or enough confidence. The field was what it was. The question was always whether the operator knew what the field was, and Tuck Dillard had now learned it in the way that everyone eventually learned it on this field, which was through the direct education of contact. Wick had not seen the incident. He had been working the upper section when it happened. He knew the spot without needing to see it. When he came down the slope on his next pass and crossed through the area of the false flat, he adjusted the drawbar height on the Ford with a touch that raised the hitch point 2 inches for the distance of about 30 yards, a compensation that transferred as a slight header rise on the Alice Chalmers, keeping the cutting height consistent through the grade change without the machine or the Ford needing to do anything dramatic. It was a motion he had practiced. It was a motion that came from 20 years of watching what happened to equipment at that spot in the field. It took perhaps 4 seconds. No one at the fence line would have known to look for it. The afternoon moved. The light went from white to gold, and the shadows of the ridgeline began to move across the upper field, and the air began to carry the slight cooling that comes in Letcher County in August, when the sun gets low enough that the mountains take some of the edge off it. The crowd at the fence had grown through the afternoon. Word had kept moving along the creek roads and through the phone lines, and by 4 o'clock there were close to 60 people along the lower fence, more than had been there at noon, more than had been at the fairgrounds that morning. They were quiet in the way that had become the characteristic sound of the day. Walt Greer pulled his samples every 90 minutes and entered his figures and the notebook pages filled with numbers that told the story of 2 approaches to the same piece of ground. One optimized for volume and general conditions. One calibrated to the specific behavior of this particular field in this particular year, based on the accumulated specific knowledge of a man who had farmed it for decades and left his understanding in 15 pages of handwriting in a composition book. By 5:30, the usable corn was down to the final section at the south end of the field, the section nearest the creek, where the morning fog moisture had produced a marginally better crop. Even in the drought, the section where the afternoon ground temperature was dropping faster than the upper field because of the water proximity, which was a condition Clem had noted in 1974 and had specified a response to creekside, late afternoon humidity rising from water reduce, cylinder 10 revolutions per minute from afternoon setting, watch the concave for plugging. Wick made the final adjustment at 5:25, standing beside the Alice Chalmers. In the cooling afternoon, the box wrench in his hand, the notebook open on the Ford seat beside him, Clem's final entry visible in the amber light. He thought for a moment about Clem at whatever kitchen table in whatever evening light writing this down, writing it down for a field he had worked for years in a notebook he had filled over decades. For a reader he had no way of knowing would ever exist. He put the wrench back on the hook. He got back in the Ford and put it in low gear and drove into the last of the standing corn with the Alice Chalmers pulling steady behind him, the cylinder turning at 915 revolutions per minute, the concave at its specified clearance, the ground speed at 2.5 miles per hour, the whole machine running the way Clem had said to run it in the conditions Clem had said would exist at this time of day in this part of the field. The grain went into the tank, clean. At 6:15, the light had gone the particular color that August light goes in Kentucky when it is nearly done, the long amber gold of late afternoon turning toward the first blue, suggestions of evening, the shadows of the sycamores along the road fence, stretching across the stubble field in lines so long they seemed to be reaching for the ridge. Wick brought the Allis-Chalmers to the end of the final row and disengaged the separator and let the Ford coast to a stop at the lower fence. He shut off the engine. The machine wound down through its harmonics, the cylinder slowing from 915 revolutions per minute through its descending sequence, the auger stopping the reel, coming to rest. The sounds of the day came back as the machine went quiet. The creak the birds starting their evening adjustments in the tree line, the distant sound of trucks on the road. He sat on the drawbar with his hat in his hands. His left hand was trembling. It always trembled. Had trembled by evening since the late fall of 1944 on a ship in a Philippine sea. After what had happened at Leyte Gulf, the tremor that the doctors at the VA said was physiological, the consequence of a nervous system that had experienced something it had not been built to process, and that had never fully resolved the experience. He had learned to manage it through the day, keeping his hands occupied, but by evening, when the work stopped and the hands had nothing left to do, it came back. He did not hide it. He sat on the drawbar and let his left hand do what it did, and he looked out at the field. 37 acres of Letcher County slope, ground drought-dry stubble cut, now across its full expanse, the two machines at the bottom edge of it representing two different theories about what farming required and what knowledge was worth. Walt Greer was at his tailgate doing the final calculations. The numbers took time because they were the kind of numbers that deserved to be checked twice before they were spoken. The crowd along the fence was so quiet that the creak was audible from where they stood. Walt Greer did not rush his calculations. He was a man who understood that the integrity of a measurement resided partly in the deliberateness with which it was recorded, that numbers written in haste carried a different authority than numbers written with care, and that on a day like this one, in front of a crowd like this one, the authority of the numbers was going to matter. He worked through the final sample assessments at his tailgate with his moisture meter and his crack screen and his scale pulling figures from his notebook, and running them against the dockage tables he had brought from the office, doing the arithmetic longhand the way he had been taught to do it, and then checking it on the small calculator he kept in his shirt pocket. The crowd along the fence did not press toward him. There was a quality to the silence that communicated something, a shared understanding that what was being calculated was something more than bushels per acre, that the numbers Walt was writing down were the final language of a question that the day had been asking since 9 that morning, and that this language deserved the time it needed to be correct. Harmon Buell had come off his tailgate for the first time since noon. He was standing at the gate in the lower fence with his arms at his sides, not leaning on anything, not talking to anyone, just standing. He had owned this field for 36 years, and he had watched it do things to men and machines that the men and machines had not anticipated. And he had developed over those 36 years the particular patience of a man who has accepted that the ground operates on its own schedule, and that the appropriate response to this is attention rather than argument. He was looking at the Allis-Chalmers, not at Wick, who was still sitting on the drawbar with his hat in his hands and his left hand doing what his left hand did in the evenings, at the machine, at the Persian orange paint that had come back to something close to its original depth on the sections Wick had been able to reach with the polish cloth, at the cylinder housing and the elevator and the header, all of it intact, none of it showing the strain marks or the impact damage or the bent metal, that difficult ground extracted from equipment that met it without sufficient understanding. The machine looked in the amber light of 6:15 in the evening like something that had been doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was what it had been doing. Walt closed his notebook. He looked at the figures for a moment, the final line of each column, the numbers that represented the complete accounting of the day's work on Harmon Buell's East Field by two machines approaching the same 37 acres from two different positions relative to what the ground required. He picked up his notebook and walked to the gate. The crowd moved back slightly to let him through. Not dramatically, just the small adjustment that people make when a man with a purpose is moving toward a specific place. He walked to the space between the two machines and turned to face the field and the people along the fence. And he read the numbers in the clear, carrying voice of a man who had been giving extension reports at field meetings for 17 years and understood the difference between reading to a room and reading at a room. Tuck Dillard, John Deere, 6620, 1987 model. Total harvest 24.7 acres. Grain moisture 15.3%, crack rate 18%, adjusted effective yield 68.2 bushels per effective acre. He paused for one beat. Wick Voss Alice Chalmers, Model 60 all-crop harvester, 1952. Total harvest 21.4 acres. Grain moisture 15.1%, crack rate 4.2%, adjusted effective yield 73.6 bushels per effective acre. He looked at his notebook. On the agreed 30-acre comparison basis, accounting for quality adjusted volume on equivalent acreage, Voss machine produced 342 additional usable bushels. He said the market price. He said the number, 342 bushels at $1.94 per bushel, $663.48 in additional value, from a machine that had been purchased from a dead man's storage unit for $30 and restored with $29.40 in parts. Walt closed the notebook. He did not add anything. He did not need to. The fence line absorbed the numbers the way a field absorbs rain after a long drought completely, and immediately the figures going into the community's accounting of the day and of the men involved in it, and of the questions the day had raised about what knowledge was worth and where it lived and what happened to it when the man who carried it was gone. Ronnie Fitch was still on the fence rail. He was 29 years old, and he had driven out to this field in the morning with a vague feeling that he should be here, and he had been here all day, and now he was trying to hold in his head what he had watched happen across 9 hours of August heat on a difficult piece of ground. And the thing he kept coming back to was not the numbers, though. The numbers were not nothing. The thing he kept coming back to was the way Wick Voss had moved through the day, without doubt. Not with the performed confidence of a man who is trying to convince an audience, with the actual absence of doubt that comes from knowing something completely, from having prepared with the specific preparation that the specific situation required, from having in your possession information that was precisely applicable to the precise conditions you were facing. He had watched Wick make the concave adjustment at the noon break with a single wrench in 10 minutes, and he had understood, watching those hands on that bolt, that what he was seeing was not improvisation, it was execution. The adjustment had been planned before the day began. The adjustment had been planned before the bet was made. The adjustment had been sitting in Clem Ferris's notebook since 1974, waiting for the afternoon conditions it described. Ronnie did not know yet what he was going to do with what he had learned today. He knew that he was going to do something with it. The crowd began to move after Walt's numbers. Not all at once, not with drama, but in the gradual way that crowds disperse when the main event has concluded and the secondary conversations are beginning, people breaking into the smaller groups that process a shared experience by discussing it from different angles. Trucks started. Men who had come from Whitesburg and from the far side of the county began the drive home. The ones who lived closer stayed longer, leaning on fence posts and tailgates, talking in the low, unhurried tones that this part of Kentucky used for conversations that mattered. Harmon Buell walked to where Wick was sitting. He stood in front of him for a moment. He said, "I have been watching men work this field since 1951. Nobody ever ran it quite the way you ran it today." Wick looked up at him. He said Clem ran it right. "I ran it the way Clem told me to." Harmon looked at the machine. He said Clem was something. He was Wick said. Harmon stood there in another moment. Then he said that Wick was welcome to work the field for nothing for as long as he wanted, and he said it in the tone of a man who considers himself to be offering something he owes rather than something he is giving, and he walked back to his truck without waiting for a response. The light had gone from gold to the first blue-gray of early evening. The creek was audible now that both machines were quiet, a small, steady sound in the deepening evening, the water doing what water does in August in a drought, year running low but running, keeping its particular promise that it makes to the land and keeps regardless of conditions. Tuck Dillard climbed down from his cab for the last time. He had been sitting in the machine after Walt's announcement, the engine off the cab quiet, not hiding, not avoiding, simply sitting in the kind of stillness that a man sits in when he has received information that requires processing before he can respond to it correctly. He was 38 years old and he had not been wrong in public before, not like this, not in front of the community that his family's name meant something in, not about something that he had been certain of when the day began. He climbed down and stood for a moment beside the front wheel of the 6620, looking at the bent dividers on the left header section, the visible evidence of the encounter with the false flat that he had not known to anticipate because he had never needed to know the field. Then he walked across the stubble. The crowd that remained watched him make that walk without speaking. The stubble was ankle deep and dry, and it made a consistent sound under his feet as he crossed the 30 yards between his machine and the Alice Chalmers, a sound that was the only sound in the field at that moment besides the creek and the evening birds. He walked like a man who has decided to do a thing and is doing it without performance, without the added weight of an audience's expectations, simply putting one foot in front of the other in the direction he had chosen to go. He stopped in front of Wick. Wick looked up at him. Tuck put his hand out. He said, "I don't understand it. I genuinely don't understand it." He was not performing. That was the thing that the people watching from the fence would talk about afterward, the quality that Ronnie Fitch would describe years later as the most honest thing he had ever heard a man say at the end of a day like that. Tuck Dillard was not managing the moment. He was not framing his acknowledgement in terms that preserved his position or qualified his concession. He was saying a true thing in the simplest available language. "I don't understand it." Wick stood up from the drawbar. He took the hand. He said from a dead man's notebook and 20 years of watching this field. Tuck held the handshake for a moment longer than a perfunctory handshake lasts. Then he nodded once. He turned and walked back to his machine. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The nod was the whole of what he could offer, and it was in the accounting of men who understood what it cost enough. Tuck Dillard had grown up in a county where a man's word and a man's handshake carried the same weight, and what he had just extended across those 30 yards of stubble was the maximum acknowledgement available to a man whose identity had been organized around certainty and who was now quietly and without theater, revising the most public certainty of his adult life. He drove the 6620 off the field under its own power and back up the road toward Whitesburg. The crowd watched the big machine go. Then they looked at the orange machine at the bottom of the field. Then they started talking. The conversation that moved through Letcher County over the following weeks was not the kind of conversation that requires embellishment because the plain facts of the day were sufficiently extraordinary that no embellishment added anything to them. A 1952 machine bought for $30 restored for $29.40 had produced more usable grain per acre than a 1987 machine that cost $47,200 on a field that both machines had worked in the same conditions on the same day. Walt Greer's numbers were in his official notebook, and he had mentioned them in the Extension Service monthly report in September. The Whitesburg paper ran 18 column inches in the second week of September with a photograph of the Alice Chalmers in the Buell field that a man named Carson Combs had taken with his Kodak from the fence line at about 10 in the morning. The machine moving through the drought corn with the Ford ahead of it and the ridgeline behind it, and the August light coming down at the angle that made everything in the mountains look simultaneously ordinary and significant. Wick did not read the article until someone left a copy in his mailbox. He read it at the kitchen table with the blue cup beside him, and he found it accurate, and he set it down and went back to work. The Cumberland Valley Bank renegotiated his operating loan in October. The loan officer, who called a man named Garrett Estep, who had been at the bank for 12 years and had grown up in Letcher County and had a cousin who had been at the Buell Field fence line, did not mention the harvest. He did not need to. The conversation was about loan terms and payment schedules and the realistic projection of the farm's capacity to service its debt. And the conversation went differently than it would have gone in March when the farm had been $4,200 behind. And the summer had looked like what August always looks like before, how August is going to end. Wick paid the loan off in the fall of 1990. He did it in 3 years. Instead of the 5 the renegotiated schedule had allowed, using the income from 2 full seasons on his own ground and from the work he did on neighboring farms through 1988 and 1989, the difficult acreage, the slope fields and the rocky bottoms, and the places where the big modern equipment lost efficiency to the terrain that required something other than horsepower. He charged fair rates and he never advertised. He did not need to advertise. Letcher County knew what had happened at the Buell field, and the farms with hard ground knew who to call when the standard approaches produce standard disappointments. He ran the Alice Chalmers for 2 more seasons on that circuit. In the fall of 1990, he loaded it on the trailer for the last time and drove it to Lexington. The Kentucky Historical Farm Museum occupied a converted farm property on the eastern edge of the city, a collection of agricultural equipment and documents and structures that represented the material history of farming in the Commonwealth, assembled over 3 decades by people who understood that the objects and the records of agricultural practice were primary historical documents of a civilization and deserved the same care as any other primary source. The director was a woman named Patricia Stamper, who had grown up on a farm in Madison County and had studied agricultural history at the University of Kentucky and had spent 15 years building the museum's collection with the particular combination of scholarship and practical knowledge that the work required. She met Wick in the parking lot when he pulled in with the trailer. She walked around the machine without touching it, the way you walk around something you are assessing, taking it in from different angles, noting condition and completeness. The Persian orange paint, the intact cylinder housing, the replaced elevator belt, the fabricated bat boards, the new main drive belt, still showing the relative freshness of a part that had not yet accumulated seasons of dust and oil. She asked him about the restoration. He told her $29.40. She looked at him. He said $30 for the unit, $29.40 for parts, $59.40 total. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and it worked. He said it worked. She asked about the notebook. He had brought it in a separate envelope, Clem's composition book, with its small, precise handwriting and its 40 years of accumulated specific knowledge, the adjustment charts and the field diagrams and the entries that began in the early 1950s, when Clem had first learned the machine and ended in 1974, 5 years before his death, when the final entry about the Buell East Field had recorded everything Clem had learned about that particular combination of terrain and crop and machine condition. Patricia Stamper held the notebook in both hands, the way you hold something old and irreplaceable. She read the first page. She read the last page. She was quiet for a long moment, standing in the parking lot with the notebook open in her hands and the Lexington afternoon going about its business around her. She said, "This is the most significant agricultural document we have received in 10 years, possibly longer. A primary source record of site-specific machine operation for a specific Kentucky watershed, written over 4 decades by a working farmer who understood what he was recording and why. Wick said he wrote it for the machine and the ground, not for a museum. Patricia looked at him. She said the best documents always are. She carried the notebook inside with both hands. Clem Ferris's 40 years of knowledge found its permanent home in a climate-controlled archive in a converted farmhouse in Lexington, Kentucky, cataloged and preserved and available to researchers who needed to understand how farmers in southeastern Kentucky had worked their ground in the middle decades of the 20th century, what they had known and how they had known it and how they had recorded it for whoever came after. If you want to find it, it is still there. What Tuck Dillard did in the years after the Buell Field is a question that does not have a simple answer. And Wick Voss, who was not a man who talked much about other men's private evolutions, would not have offered one if asked. What happened was gradual and practical and without drama, which was the only kind of change that lasted in Letcher County, where dramatic changes tended to be weather-related and therefore temporary. Tuck began asking questions, not publicly, not at county meetings or dealership events where asking questions might have registered as admission of something. Privately, in the specific context where he needed to understand something and the understanding mattered more than the appearance of already knowing, he asked the farmers who brought their equipment in for service about the particular conditions on their particular ground. He started reading the extension reports that he had previously received and filed without opening. He hired a retired county agent named Morris Halcomb to consult on the management of the slope ground. In his portfolio, the acreage that his contracted operators had been working with the equipment that was available rather than the equipment that was optimal, with results that had been acceptable in good years and quietly poor in bad ones. He called Wick in the spring of 1989 about 40 acres of hillside ground on the northern end of his holdings ground that his operators had been leaving partially unharvested because the terrain exceeded the efficient operating range of the equipment they were running. He asked if Wick would look at it. Wick drove out. He walked the 40 acres with the attention he gave to any ground he was considering working, reading the slope and the soil and the drainage pattern and the places where the shale came close to the surface and the places where the deeper ground allowed more flexibility. He walked it the way Clem had walked ground before, writing about it with his hands in the soil at several points and his eyes on the full picture of the field rather than on any single feature. He ran the Alice Chalmers on it in August of 1989. He charged Tuck $200 for the day. Tuck paid without comment. What passed between them over those years was not friendship exactly, and it was not the simple transaction of a man hiring a service. It was something more like the gradual adjustment of two men to a reality that the Buell Field had established. The reality that knowledge of specific ground in specific conditions was not replaceable by equipment regardless of the equipment's capability, and that the man who possessed that knowledge and had done the work to acquire it had something that could not be purchased at a dealership, not at any price. Tuck Dillard never fully became a humble man. That is probably the honest accounting of it. He had been formed by decades of operating from a position of resource and certainty, and those decades had produced habits of thought that did not reverse completely. But something had changed in the specific and practical way that useful changes in actual people change, which is to say not all the way, but far enough to matter. He stopped announcing things at county meetings. He started listening longer before he spoke. He told his son years later, when the son was old enough to work the dealership floor, that the most expensive lesson he had ever received had cost him nothing but the certainty he had been carrying since he was 20 years old, and that the loss of it had turned out to be less damaging than he had expected. Ronnie Fitch went home from the Buell Field that evening and sat in his kitchen and thought for a long time. He was 29 years old and had been farming his family's 80 acres for 6 years, and had been operating with the equipment that was available and the knowledge that he had acquired informally, and the assumption that the modern approach was the correct approach because the modern approach was what everyone around him was using. He had been a capable farmer in the way that capable farmers are capable when things are normal, which is to say that he had been adequate to ordinary conditions and had learned something hard every time conditions were not ordinary. What he had watched at the Buell field was not about old machines being better than new ones. He understood that clearly, even at 29, even on the evening of the day itself, what he had watched was about the relationship between specific knowledge and specific conditions, about the difference between a general approach and a calibrated one about what happened when a man brought exactly the right understanding to exactly the right situation. He started collecting old equipment the following spring, not as nostalgia, not as sentiment, as tools selected for specific applications on his specific 80 acres, chosen because they solved problems that his primary equipment did not solve as well. By the mid-1990s, his barn held 3 fully restored vintage machines alongside his modern equipment, an Oliver A. Massey Ferguson and an Alice Chalmers Model 100 that he used on the difficult acreage at the north end of his property where the rocky slope ground produced better yields under the gentler mechanical action of the older cylinder design. He said in an interview with the Whitesburg paper in 1997 that watching Wick Voss on that August day in 1987 was the most important farming education he had ever received, and that it had cost him nothing but a Saturday and the willingness to pay attention. Harmon Buell let Wick work the East Field for nothing for the rest of his life. He said he owed him that much, and he said it in the way that men in Letcher County said things they meant without decoration, without the qualifying language that would have indicated uncertainty about the statement. He died in 1993 at 77, having watched his difficult field harvested correctly by the same machine for 6 seasons, and the fact that he lived long enough to see this happen was a thing that seemed, in retrospect, like something the field had arranged for him. Wick Voss stayed on the Route 119 farm until 1998. He was 74 that year, and the work had become honestly and without self-deception more than one body could manage alone. He had known for 2 years that it was becoming too much. He had kept going because the farm was the structure of his days, and because leaving it would require constructing a different structure, which was work of a different kind than any he had done before. He sold the 67 acres to a young couple from Bell County who had heard about the farm through the county agricultural network, people who wanted to do the kind of mixed operation that the land suited, who understood that the ground had a history and were prepared to learn it. He sold the land at fair market value. He moved into a small house in Neon, the town nearest the old Nave storage facility, which had been torn down in 1994 to make way for a Dollar General. The 12 corrugated metal units had come down in a single afternoon. Unit 7, where Clem Ferris's machine had sat for 8 years, waiting for someone to stop, was gone with the rest of them. But what was inside it had already done its work. Wick lived in the house in Neon until March of 2003 when he died at 79. March was the month he had always associated with the end of one thing and the beginning of another, the month when Letcher County stopped being entirely winter and started negotiating with spring, when the creek ran high with snowmelt and the ridgeline timber showed the first faint green of leaf buds, and the ground began to warm in the lower fields where the sun reached longest. He had spent 60 years watching March happen to eastern Kentucky and had never stopped finding it remarkable. He died on a Tuesday, which was the day of the week he had always associated with June, because Tuesday was the day she had gone out on the ice road and not come back, and perhaps there was something in that, or perhaps there was not. And the honest answer was that no one could know. He was buried at the Neon Community Church Cemetery on the hill above town where the graves went back to the 1880s and the view on a clear day extended across 3 ridges to the south. The blue cup was on the counter when the neighbors came to sort through the house. It was enamelware blue with a white rim worn down to bare metal on the drinking edge, 15 cents at the First Baptist Fall Social in 1959, back when the mountains had looked exactly the way they looked that morning and every morning after. Someone wrapped it carefully and set it aside. Some things you do not throw away. What remains of the day at Harmon Buell's East Field lives in the places where things like that live in the records of the Letcher County Extension Service, in Walt Greer's field notebooks, which went to the Extension Archives when he retired in 2001 in the Kentucky Historical Farm Museum in Lexington, where Clem Ferris's composition book sits in a climate-controlled archive with its small, precise handwriting recording 40 years of specific knowledge about a machine and a county's ground knowledge that had been transferred from a dead man's storage unit to a living man's hands, and from a living man's hands to a community's understanding of what farming required and what knowledge was worth. The machine is in the museum. The Persian orange paint is behind glass now, in a building where the temperature and humidity are controlled and the light is calibrated, and the machine will not be worked again. It is an artifact now rather than a tool, but it spent its working life being exactly what it was built to be, a tool designed for the kind of farming that existed in the places that needed it, precise and adjustable and honest about what it could do and why, and the fact that it became an artifact at the end of that life is not a diminishment. It is just what happens to tools that outlive the conditions that required them. The notebook is next to it in the archive. Patricia Stamper, who retired from the museum directorship in 2005, said in her retirement remarks that the Ferris notebook represented something she had tried to articulate for 20 years. The principle that agricultural knowledge was not merely technical, but was embedded in place and time and the specific relationship between a particular farmer and a particular piece of ground, and that this knowledge was as historically significant and as irreplaceable as any other form of primary cultural record. She said when Wick Voss brought us that machine and that notebook, he was preserving not just equipment and documents, he was preserving the proof that one man's lifetime of paying attention to one piece of ground in one Kentucky county was worth something. Was worth, as it turned out, more than anyone had accounted for, except the man who did the paying attention. Let me close with something simple. Wick Voss did not win a competition on a dry August day in 1987 because he had a better machine. He had a different machine, one suited to specific conditions that he understood specifically, and he knew what the machine could do and what the ground required and how to read the relationship between the two across the changing conditions of a full harvest day. And this knowledge came from 40 years of another man's careful observation recorded in a composition book that had been waiting in a storage unit for 8 years for someone to stop and open the door. He won because he had done something that cost nothing except time and attention, and the willingness to believe that the things worth knowing were still worth knowing even after the world had moved on to newer and louder answers. He had studied his circumstances. He had found and read and internalized the accumulated wisdom of someone who had come before him. He had invested 6 weeks of night work in a machine that looked like nothing and turned out to be precisely the right tool for the precise problem in front of him. And he had walked out to that field on a hot August morning in front of 60 people who had various degrees of expectation about what was going to happen. And he had done the work the way the work needed to be done, at the pace the work required, with the adjustments the conditions called for in the time available. That is the whole of it. The blue cup, the notebook on the table, the man in the barn before dawn checking the tension on a belt, not because he was worried, but because he respected what the day was going to ask of him, and he wanted to be ready to answer it correctly. That is what it looks like when a man knows what he is doing. Not loud, not fast, not impressive in any way that announces itself before the work is done. Just a man with the right knowledge on the right ground with the right tool, doing the thing exactly the way the thing needed to be done. And the machine running clean in the August heat, and the grain going into the tank, and the evening coming on over the mountains, the way the evening always came, the ridge lines going from gold to blue, the creek finding its voice in the cooling air, the long day settling into the particular quiet of a thing completed. Wickvoss drove home with the trailer behind him. The Ford's transmission slipped in third gear the way it always did. The blue cup was on the counter. The mountains did not notice either way. They never had.